Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Insidious, Chapter 3. Certain horror movie franchises are kind of haunted by the reputation of the original film or the original director. And it's a reputation they can never really shake off, that no matter what you do to the characters or what you do to the franchise, people will always go, yeah, but the best one's the first one, or the best one's an earlier one. And Insidious wears that badge like any horror franchise, but like any horror franchise, that you can tell it's moving further down the line and down the franchise in terms of quality. Now, the first two were directed by James Wan, who also directed The Conjuring, Saw, and recently directed Furious 7. And now this is directed by Leigh Whannell, who helped write and produce the Saw films, and helped come up with and write the previous two Insidious films, so he is kind of an architect of it. He isn't really the master director at making a haunted house movie the way James Wan did, and you can feel his more studio director attempt at doing so, making this feel a lot more like a cash grab, cash in than the previous two films, and making it feel a lot cheaper than James Wan and the previous films ever did. Insidious Chapter 3 is a prequel. It actually takes place a couple years before the first Insidious. When, we don't know, but presumably it is in the mid to late 2000s, so sometime between 2005 and when the first Insidious film came out. This girl, Quinn, who tries to contact Elsie Rayner from the first film to communicate to her mother, who died about 18 months before. She tells her she doesn't really do that anymore, but she does tell her that she has tried to communicate with the dead and tried to communicate with her mother, and that she should be careful because once you communicate with the dead, you're not just communicating with her, you're communicating with all the dead, and that evil spirits can come out, like they told you in the first two Insidious movies. But Elsie Rayner does not communicate to her mother for her, although she tries. She goes home and is contacted by spirits, but assumes it might be her mother and communicates back, until when she's in New York after an audition, she sees someone waving at her, waves back, and then suddenly gets hit by a car, and after her two legs are broken and is immobile in bed, keeps hearing knocks on the walls and various strange things, hoping it's her mother, but realizing that a demon has come out to claim her and is slowly trying to take parts and parts of her soul, as Elsie has been brought in to try to stop this evil demon from taking her soul completely and taking possession of Quinn's body. One of the things I liked a lot about, specifically, I guess, the first Insidious film and a little bit of the second Insidious film, but I guess really the first Insidious and The Conjuring, is James Wan is really good at not just making a horror movie, but making a good audience horror movie, something that the whole audience will jump up during and laugh at how they got scared at this one thing, and he's really good at making those sequences. He's a real audience-friendly director, and that really worked for those Insidious films. That's what made them so much fun. But this director, Leigh Whannell, doesn't really have that. He is good at the cheap scare, which is kind of all this movie does. He does a lot of jump scares and cheap scares. Really, this whole film is built on jump scares. There's nothing but jump scares. And jump scares are fine. They're good to get you in the mood, and they're cheap. And I was fine with them while I was watching this, but after a while, I kept thinking, like, man, there's like a lot of jump scares. Like, I would think most horror movies would kind of calm down on that after a certain point. But Leigh Whannell doesn't care. He just keeps going for it. And it makes the horror feel a little emptier. It makes it feel a little cheaper. It's like going to a cheesy haunted house and laughing about it with your friends afterwards, but kind of knowing you just did something a little silly and you had fun, but you're not really going to think about it other than, you know, it was nice. I don't know. And that's his direction. It's nice. It's fine. He can make it entertaining enough, but not entertaining to make it like really interesting and make you maybe want to see a fourth Insidious film. The way he was hired, being a screenwriter and then working his way up to director, is kind of like how they used to do franchises. When people didn't really care who directed sequels long ago, they would just kind of promote someone from the previous film and try to use the same crew. And that's kind of gone away. It's usually a big deal who's directing a sequel. But in this case, they went the old school route. And in some ways, his direction does feel a little bland. He almost feels like he's treading water. Now, he treaded water really well. He didn't sink. He got out of the pool. But I don't think Insidious Chapter 3 excelled after that. It is surface level in what it's doing. And it's a prequel. You have to give it some credit for not being a total lame horror movie prequel and going more into the monster of the previous Insidious films and going more into their backstory, which helps over-explain them, which makes them less scary on repeat viewings because you know all this stupid backstory, which you really don't need to know. Curiosity and fan fiction combined makes shitty horror movie prequels. And so I'm glad they didn't do that, and they don't harp on it too often, but there are a couple moments where it's like, and that was the origin of that, which is a prequel essential, I guess. For some reason they had to do it. They don't bring up too much about it, but it still felt a little too much every time they did it. Also because at the end of Insidious Chapter 2, they kind of act like that's hinting at what 3 is going to be, and then they're like, nope, we're going backwards. Okay, are we going back forwards next time? Is that why did we see that at the end then? You didn't plan this out, did you? And that kind of feels a little lame. I understand we have a lot of continuity now in franchises, but it feels a little weird, like, why did you set that up? I like the kind of flow they had going where it's like at the end of 1 they set up 2, and at the end of 2 they set up something that maybe will happen. I did like the returning cast members. Lin Shaye is pretty much the star of the Insidious films in my mind. If they ever made an Insidious film without her, I would just not fucking see it. It's cool that a character actor like her is getting like a prime spot in this horror franchise, and she's really good. Probably would have been more interesting if you're going to do a prequel to focus more on her instead of this young girl. I understand, like, it's a horror movie, you have to have a pretty girl who gets haunted and all this stuff. That feels a little boring at this point. You can tell the film understood, this girl played by Stephanie Scott, that she wasn't that interesting, since they really just get right to plot. Right at the beginning they get really into it. I think this film is structured actually fairly well, but they understand, like, you don't really care about her, so we're not going to develop her too much. We're not going to go into too much character development, although you know some things, but it kind of just drops it after a while. And I like seeing Lee Wetnall, who of course is in the first 2 also, and Agnes Sampson, who was also had a part in Fury Road, by the way. I like those 2 guys. They're not really funny. If they were in a room, I would hang out with them and talk about dumb cult 80s movies and stuff, and I feel like we would get along. But there's no real part in these movies, particularly this one, that I thought really stood out for them, although he was wearing a Dolph Lundgren Masters of the Universe t-shirt, and that is a guilty pleasure of mine. The thing is with horror movie sequels is they kind of have to latch on to gimmicks after a while, after you've made the follow-up to the first one and you've kept it going as long as you can, and then you start doing things like Jason Goes to Manhattan and crap. And Insidious isn't there yet, but it does feel like doing a prequel as the third one feels a little desperate at this point. It kind of probably would have been a little more interesting if they had actually done what they said they were going to do in the third one, especially since that's the logic they set up with the franchise at the end of the first one. But I think it just shows that they're kind of desperate to keep this going. When the second one came out, it was like the big movie of the weekend and people were really excited for it, and with the third one coming out, it feels like people are just not as into it. Maybe it's because James Wan didn't direct this film and people are like, who cares? But it also kind of feels like there's already franchise fatigue, and they kind of knew that, so they had to add an extra element to it to kind of hook people, but it feels kind of extra desperate. This is just kind of like a studio-made horror movie, and it works just on that level, on that very studio director, like, we had to fill this date kind of film. It was probably less annoying and probably a little better directed than something like Poltergeist. It is directed in a way that has no real distinct direction behind it. You would never really look up who this guy is except for, like, who's this guy who's not James Wan, because it doesn't really have a lot of personality. Lee Wetnall, he is really just trying to get this to work any way he can, and he does. I haven't seen a lot of horror movies that use jump scares as effectively. I like jump scares. I get jumpy at jump scares, and I'm fine with that, and I was fine with jumping at this, but after a while I was like, man, I've done this a couple times. The thing with horror movie sequels is you kind of have to find ways for people to keep coming back, and most of these franchises figure out a way, but this feels like a franchise that is probably going to die. It feels like people are already sick of them, and I haven't really heard of that on most franchises that go beyond a third entry. It's usually people get sick of them when they get to like 4 or 5, and that it's already happening at this point isn't exactly a good sign. It felt like a weird way, since Lin Shaye's character is actually dead. Spoilers from the previous ones, but it's kind of like you were leading us down that path and then you took us in this weird direction. Take us in the weird direction direction after you've known me a little longer. It felt a little premature. And because of that, I don't really want to go any further with this franchise. This kind of cements the idea that the Insidious films, they were fun, but I think it's time to leave this and hopefully not go into the further anymore. So if you have seen Insidious Chapter 3 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.